The night Evelyn Ashford became engaged to the Duke of Ravensmore, he raised his crystal glass and spoke another woman's name. 300 guests heard it. The chandeliers shook with the silence that followed. Champagne sat untouched in trembling hands. Somewhere near the back of the room, a woman in emerald silk pressed her fingers to her lips to hide a smile. Evelyn heard it too. She was standing not 4 feet from him, in a white gown her mother had chosen, with pearls at her throat and her hands folded so precisely in front of her that no one, not one single soul in that gilded room, could have guessed what was happening behind her eyes. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She simply stood and let the moment stretch and breathed. People would speak about it for weeks. Some said she had not heard. Some said she was too simple to understand. Some whispered that the poor girl had been humiliated beyond recovery, that the engagement would surely be dissolved before morning. None of them knew Evelyn Ashford. None of them knew that in the 3 seconds between hearing his voice and lifting her own glass, she had already decided exactly what she was going to do. She said nothing that night. But Evelyn Ashford had never, in all her quiet, careful, underestimated life, done nothing. The engagement had not been Evelyn's idea. It had not been the Duke's idea either, which was perhaps the only thing the two of them had ever agreed upon. It had been arranged the previous March in her father's study, over a decanter of brandy and a great deal of paperwork. Evelyn had not been present for the conversation. She had been in the library, 3 rooms away, reading a letter from her friend in Bath, when her mother appeared in the doorway with an expression that was trying very hard to be excitement and not quite managing it. "You are to be married, darling," her mother had said. Evelyn had looked up from her letter. To whom? "The Duke of Ravensmore." A pause. "I don't believe I've met him." "You haven't, but your father has, and he finds him most suitable." Evelyn had set her letter down, smoothed the page carefully, and said nothing for a long moment. Outside the library window, the March rain was turning the garden to mud. She watched a sparrow fight the wind for a moment, then give up and disappear into the hedgerow. "All right," she had said finally. Her mother had blinked. She had perhaps expected tears or argument or the kind of dramatic collapse that her sister Charlotte was so gifted at producing. What she had not expected was that particular stillness, that quiet all right, as though Evelyn were simply noting the weather. What her mother did not understand, what almost no one in Evelyn's life had ever taken the trouble to understand, was that Evelyn's silences were not emptiness. They were patience. She had learned very early that the world moved faster when she watched it carefully, and that the people who shouted and wept and demanded rarely saw what was actually happening in front of them. She would meet the Duke of Ravensmore. She would observe him, and then she would know what all right was going to mean. She met him 6 days later, at a dinner her parents hosted in his honor. Adrian Blackwell, the 9th Duke of Ravensmore, was 31 years old, dark-haired and possessed of the particular kind of handsomeness that seems almost like an inconvenience to its owner, something to be gotten through like bad weather. He was tall. He was formal. He shook her father's hand with the manner of a man completing a transaction, and when he was introduced to Evelyn, he looked at her the way one looks at a piece of furniture one has agreed to accept from an estate sale. Politely. Briefly. Without interest. "Miss Ashford," he said. "Your Grace," she replied. And that was, more or less, the full extent of their first conversation. At dinner he spoke mostly to her father, occasionally to her brother Richard, and twice to her mother about the weather in Derbyshire. He did not speak to Evelyn again. He did not ignore her rudely. It was more precise than that. He simply moved through the evening as though she were a pleasant enough feature of the room, like the wallpaper or the candlesticks, something that required no particular engagement. Evelyn watched him all evening. She noticed that he drank very little. She noticed that he listened more than he spoke. She noticed that when Richard made a joke at her expense, something about her being so quiet one forgot she was there, Adrian did not laugh, though he also did not object. He simply moved on, unhurried, as though the comment had not quite landed anywhere. She noticed something else, too. Something she filed away quietly, in that part of her mind where she kept things that might matter later. When the dinner was over and the gentlemen had withdrawn, Evelyn sat with her mother and tried to explain what she had seen to herself. It was nothing dramatic, nothing she could name clearly, just the faint, persistent impression that Adrian Blackwell was a man carrying something heavy, and that he had been carrying it for a very long time. She did not know yet what it was, but Evelyn Ashford was patient. She could wait. The engagement ball was held on the 14th of October at Ravensmore House in London. 300 invitations had been sent. 300 guests arrived. The ballroom had been dressed in white and gold, and the champagne was very good, and the orchestra played beautifully, and everything was exactly as it should have been. Evelyn wore white as was expected. She wore the pearls her grandmother had left her. She stood where she was placed, spoke when she was spoken to, and watched. She watched the room fill. She watched the candles burn lower. She watched her mother beam at the assembled company with the particular glow of a woman who had successfully married off the daughter everyone had quietly given up on. She watched Adrian. He moved through the room with the ease of a man on familiar ground, greeting guests, exchanging pleasantries, wearing his title the way he wore his evening coat, well-fitted, well-practiced, entirely without joy. He came to Evelyn's side 3 times during the evening. Each time he was correct and courteous and utterly elsewhere. She was beginning to understand that this was simply who he was. And then the moment came. The orchestra paused. A footman appeared with a fresh tray of glasses. The crowd shifted and settled, sensing that something was about to be said. Adrian moved to the center of the room. He took a glass. He turned to face the assembled company, and Evelyn watched his face. And for just one moment, one single, unguarded moment, she saw something move across it. Not love exactly, not happiness, something rawer than that, something almost like grief. He raised his glass, and he said her name, not Evelyn's name. "To Lady Sinclair," he said, "may this evening find her well." The room went very still. Evelyn did not move. She did not look at the woman in emerald silk who stood near the back of the room with her fingers pressed to her lips. She did not look at her mother, whose smile had gone glassy and fixed. She did not look at Richard, who was standing near the door with an expression she could not quite read from across the room. She looked at Adrian. He had already looked away. Evelyn lifted her own glass very slowly and brought it to her lips. Around her, after a long and terrible moment, the room began to breathe again. The orchestra resumed. Conversations restarted, quieter now, electric with the particular thrill of witness scandal. No one spoke to Evelyn directly. No one quite knew what to say. That was perfectly fine. Evelyn had a great deal to think about. And she had learned, a very long time ago, that she thought best in silence. London spoke of nothing else for 4 days. Evelyn knew this because her mother told her so, in increasingly agitated installments, beginning at breakfast the morning after the ball and continuing without meaningful pause through the following Tuesday. The story had apparently traveled from Ravensmore House to Mayfair to Belgravia, and back again, with the speed and enthusiasm of something that did not need any help at all. "People are saying he is in love with her," her mother said on the first morning, stirring her tea with unnecessary force. "People are saying the engagement will be dissolved," she said on the second. "People are saying," she said on the 4th day, setting down her cup with a small decisive click, "that you ought to have wept, that a display of feeling would have helped considerably." Evelyn looked up from her correspondence. "Helped whom?" she asked. Her mother did not have a satisfying answer to that, and so the conversation moved on. Evelyn had no interest in what people were saying. She was interested in Lady Vivienne Sinclair. She began, as she always began, with observation. This was not difficult. Vivienne Sinclair was not a woman who avoided being observed. She was 26 years old, the widow of a baronet who had left her his name and very little else, and she moved through London society with the particular confidence of a woman who understood precisely what she had and how to use it. She was beautiful in a way that seemed almost deliberate: dark eyes, pale skin, a laugh that carried across a room and made everyone in it feel that they were missing something. Men admired her. Women were cautious around her. Hostesses invited her because she made their parties interesting and did not invite her because they did not entirely trust their husbands in the same room. Evelyn had met her twice before the ball briefly, at the sort of large gatherings where one meets everyone briefly, and had formed no strong impression either way. She was charming. She was clever. She was the kind of woman who made you feel somehow that she was paying you a great compliment simply by speaking to you. Evelyn had filed her away and thought no more about it. Now she thought about it considerably more. The first thing Evelyn noticed was how Vivienne looked at Adrian. They were at Lady Pemberton's afternoon musical, 4 days after the ball, the first social engagement Evelyn had attended since the incident, as her mother was now calling it, in a tone that suggested it ranked somewhere between natural disaster and personal failing. Evelyn had come because not coming would have meant something, and she was not ready yet for things to mean what people wanted them to mean. Vivienne was there. Of course she was there. Evelyn positioned herself near the window, accepted a cup of tea she did not drink, and watched. Vivienne crossed the room to Adrian within 5 minutes of his arrival. This was not unusual. Half the room crossed to Adrian within 5 minutes of his arrival, because he was a duke and that was simply how rooms worked. But Vivienne moved differently. She moved with the ease of someone arriving at a place she already belonged, and when she reached him, she touched his arm just briefly, just lightly, and said something close to his ear that made him go very still. Not still the way a man goes still when he is moved by something tender. Still the way a man goes still when he is being reminded of something he cannot afford to forget. Evelyn watched his face. And there it was again, that same thing she had seen at the ball just before he raised his glass. Not love. Something more complicated than love. Something that looked from across a sunlit drawing room rather like a man who was not entirely free. The second thing Evelyn noticed was how Vivienne looked at everything else. She watched it over the following 2 weeks, at 4 separate engagements, with the patience that was her particular gift. Vivienne was warm with Adrian, touchingly so, publicly so, but when he was not watching, her eyes moved. They moved to the room, to the people in it, to the doors and the windows and the arrangements of furniture, with a quick, assessing intelligence that had nothing to do with warmth and everything to do with calculation. She was, Evelyn realized slowly, always measuring. The rooms she entered, the people in them, what they had and what they owed and what they might be made to do. Evelyn had seen that quality before, in a very specific category of person. People who had learned early that the world did not offer them what they needed, and had decided quietly to take it instead. She did not judge this exactly. She understood it in a distant, clinical way, the way one understands a mechanism by watching it work. But she began to understand something else as well. Vivienne Sinclair did not look at Adrian the way a woman looks at a man she loves. She looked at him the way a woman looks at a door she has not yet managed to open. The third thing Evelyn noticed was the money. This required somewhat more effort than observation alone. Evelyn wrote 2 letters, one to her father's solicitor, framed as an inquiry about her own settlement, and one to an old-school friend whose husband worked in the city and knew, as such husbands often do, a great deal about other people's financial arrangements. The picture that emerged was not dramatic. It was simply this: Lady Vivienne Sinclair, for all her emerald silk and easy confidence, was very nearly without funds. The baronet's estate had been encumbered. The income from it was modest. Her London house was leased, not owned. Her jewelry, which was considerable, had been purchased on credit that was becoming difficult to maintain. She needed money. She needed, more precisely, the kind of money that came attached to a dukedom. Evelyn sat with this information for a long afternoon, in her favorite chair by the library window, watching the October rain streak the glass. She thought about Adrian at the ball, raising his glass with that look on his face, that raw, unguarded, almost grieving look. She thought about Vivienne's hand on his arm, and the way he had gone still. She thought about the gap between what was visible and what was true, and how rarely those two things were the same, and how almost everyone she had ever known had failed to notice the difference. And she began, slowly and carefully, to revise her understanding of the situation entirely. Adrian Blackwell was not a man carelessly in love with another woman. He was a man who believed, who had been made to believe something that was not true. The question was what, exactly, he had been told. And the question after that, the one that sat quietly beneath everything else, the one Evelyn was not quite ready to look at directly, was why she cared. She had not chosen this engagement. She owed this man nothing. He had humiliated her in front of 300 people without so much as a flicker of apology. She could walk away. She could let whatever was happening happen and be done with it, and find some quieter life that had not begun with a stranger toasting another woman's name on the night of their betrothal. She could. Evelyn looked out at the rain. The sparrow was back fighting the wind again at the edge of the garden, smaller than the wind, considerably more stubborn. Not yet, she thought. Not yet. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Evelyn found it by accident, which was the only reason she found it at all. She had gone to her brother's study to return a book she had borrowed, a dry thing about agricultural reform that Richard had pressed upon her at dinner 2 weeks ago and then apparently forgotten entirely, because when she knocked and received no answer, she let herself in and found the room empty, the fire low, and a scatter of correspondence across the desk that suggested Richard had left in some haste. Evelyn set the book down. She turned to go, and then she saw the handwriting. It was on a letter half hidden beneath a copy of the Racing Gazette, written in a hand that was decorative and deliberate and utterly distinctive. The hand of a woman who had learned to write beautifully because beauty was a tool, and tools were meant to be used. Evelyn recognized it because she had, by this point, spent considerable time studying Vivienne Sinclair from across various well-appointed rooms. She recognized the loops, the particular slant, the way the capital letters leaned forward like a person in a hurry. She stood very still for a moment. Then she picked up the letter and read it. It was not long. It did not need to be. R, it began, not Richard, just R, which told Evelyn a great deal in itself. He suspects nothing. The seeds are well planted. He believes entirely that she refused his confidence. The business with the ball was inspired, I think. 300 witnesses. She cannot recover from it gracefully, whatever she does. By the time the solicitors meet in December, her position will be untenable. Proceed with the secondary arrangement as discussed. The girl is the last obstacle. Once she is removed from the equation, the rest follows naturally. The girl. Evelyn read the letter twice. Then she folded it very precisely along its original creases and placed it back exactly where she had found it, tucked beneath the Racing Gazette at the same angle, the same depth. She picked up the book she had come to return. She set it on the corner of the desk where Richard would see it. And she walked out of the study, closing the door behind her with the softest possible click, and went upstairs to her room and sat down in the chair by the window and was very, very still for a long time. She had known, in the abstract way one sometimes knows things before the evidence arrives, that Richard was not entirely what he appeared. He was 4 years older than Evelyn, and they had never been close, not unkindly, not with any open hostility, simply with the comfortable distance of two people who occupied the same house without particularly seeking each other's company. Richard was charming in the way that certain men are charming, easily and without effort, the kind of charm that fills a room and leaves no particular trace afterward. He had friends everywhere and intimates nowhere. He laughed readily and meant very little of it. Their father had loved him in the uncomplicated way fathers sometimes love their sons, proud of the surface, incurious about the depth. Evelyn had been more curious. Evelyn was always more curious. She had noticed over the years small things. The way Richard's expenses seemed always to exceed what their father provided, and the way those gaps were always smoothed over somehow, eventually, without explanation. The way he spoke about her mother's jewelry sometimes, and Evelyn's inheritance from their grandmother, with a particular attentiveness that sat just slightly wrong. The way he had responded to the news of Evelyn's engagement, not with congratulation exactly, but with a kind of focused interest, asking questions about the settlement, about the terms, about what exactly Evelyn stood to receive. She had filed these things away and thought, "He is careless with money and perhaps a little selfish, and that is not so uncommon." She had not thought, "He is building something." She thought it now. The shape of it came together slowly, over the following 2 days, as Evelyn sat with what she knew and arranged it carefully, the way one arranges pieces on a board. Richard needed money. This was the foundation of everything, not a small inconvenience, she now suspected, but something more serious, debts of a kind that could not be quietly managed. He needed access to funds he did not have and could not easily obtain. Evelyn's inheritance from their grandmother was held in trust. It was not a fortune, but it was considerable enough to matter. And the terms of that trust were specific. The money was Evelyn's, controlled by Evelyn, and could not be touched by any member of the family without her direct consent, unless her position changed, unless she were discredited, socially ruined, unless her judgment were called into question, her character undermined, her standing in society reduced to something that could be challenged. The girl is the last obstacle. Evelyn pressed her fingers together in her lap and thought about the ball, the toast, 300 witnesses. She cannot recover from it gracefully, whatever she does. It had not been an accident. It had not been Adrian, careless and lovesick, forgetting himself in public. It had been engineered. The right moment, the right audience, maximum damage. And Adrian, proud, private, already carrying something she didn't yet fully understand, had been the instrument. He had been used, wound up and aimed like a clock that doesn't know it's keeping someone else's time. The secondary question, the one that mattered perhaps more than any other, was what Vivienne had told him. He believes entirely that she refused his confidence. Evelyn turned this over and over. At some point, early in the engagement, before the ball, before Evelyn had paid Vivienne any particular attention, Vivienne had told Adrian something about Evelyn, something that made him believe Evelyn had rejected him in some private way, closed a door before he could open it. She thought about Adrian at their first dinner, looking at her with that polite, incurious gaze, as though she were furniture. Had he already been told by then? Had he already been made to believe that Evelyn wanted nothing to do with him, that she had said something to someone that had reached his ears in a form designed to wound? She thought about the silences at that dinner, the careful distance. A man who had perhaps arrived expecting coldness and found exactly what he had been prepared to find, because that was how these things worked. You saw what you had been told to see, and you called it perception. Evelyn felt something move through her that was not quite anger and not quite sorrow, something in between, a feeling for which she did not have a precise name. He had never seen her, not because he was cruel or indifferent or careless, because someone had made very sure that he wouldn't. She did not sleep well on the second night. She lay in the dark and thought about the December meeting with the solicitors, and Richard's careful timeline, and the word obstacle, and what it meant to be someone's obstacle without having done a single thing to earn it. She thought about walking away. She thought about it seriously for the first time, turning it over honestly in her mind. She could go to her father. She could show him the letter or not the letter. She had not taken the letter, but she could describe what she had read. She could dissolve the engagement herself on her own terms before Richard's plan had the chance to reach its conclusion. She could be free of all of it, the Duke, the engagement, the entire complicated machinery of other people's scheming. She could, except that Richard would simply find another way. He was patient, and he was clever, and if this route was closed to him, he would find another, and the next plan might be one she did not see coming. And Vivienne would move on to the next door, the next man who could be convinced of the right things at the right moment. And Adrian Blackwell would never know that the cold, indifferent woman he believed Evelyn to be had never existed at all. That last thought surprised her. She lay with it for a moment, slightly uncomfortable. That is not why, she told herself firmly. That is not the reason. She was not sure she entirely believed it. But morning came, and with it the particular clarity that follows a sleepless night, and Evelyn made her decision. She was not going to walk away. She was going to need help. And she was going to need, she thought, looking out at the November garden with its bare trees and iron sky, someone who had been watching this world for a great deal longer than she had. Helena Blackwell, the Dowager Duchess of Ravensmore, was 81 years old and had outlived 2 husbands, 4 prime ministers, and the patience of virtually everyone who had ever underestimated her. She was small and thin, and moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who had decided that the world could wait. Her hair was entirely white. Her eyes were entirely black, and missed nothing. She wore no jewelry except a single ring on her right hand, a dark stone in an old setting that Evelyn had never seen her without, and she had the particular quality of stillness that belongs only to people who have sat with enough of life's catastrophes to have stopped being surprised by them. Society was slightly afraid of her. Her own family was considerably afraid of her. Adrian, Evelyn had observed, treated her with the specific careful respect of a man who knew better than to try anything in her presence. Helena had said very little to Evelyn at the engagement ball. She had found her once, early in the evening, and looked at her for a long moment with those black eyes and said only, "You are quieter than I expected." Evelyn had said, "People generally expect less quiet." Helena had looked at her for another moment. Then she had made a small sound that might, in a younger woman, have been a laugh, and moved away. Evelyn had thought about that exchange several times since. She requested a call on a Wednesday morning, through the formal channels, the way one did. She was shown into Helena's private sitting room at Ravensmore House, a room that smelled of wood smoke and old paper and something faintly floral that Evelyn couldn't identify, and found the Dowager Duchess seated by the fire with a book face down in her lap, and an expression of mild interest that suggested she had been expecting this visit for some time. "Miss Ashford," Helena said. "Sit down." Evelyn sat. A maid brought tea. Helena waited until the door was closed, and then she looked at Evelyn with those careful, measuring eyes and said, "Well, what have you found?" Evelyn blinked. "Just once." "I beg your pardon." "You have been watching Vivienne Sinclair for 3 weeks," Helena said, picking up her teacup. "I have been watching you watch her. You are here because you have found something. So, what is it?" Evelyn looked at her for a moment. Then she felt something in her chest release, some small, tight thing she had been holding without fully realizing it, and she set down her own cup and told Helena everything. She spoke for a long time. Helena did not interrupt. She sat with her teacup and her expression of mild attention and let Evelyn lay it all out: Richard's letter, Vivienne's finances, the shape of the plan as Evelyn had assembled it, the December meeting with the solicitors, the word obstacle. When Evelyn finished, the fire had burned lower and the tea was cold. Helena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The thing about Adrian is that he trusts very few people. When that trust is broken, he does not repair it easily. He was told something about you. I do not know precisely what, but I know it landed in ground that was already prepared." "Prepared how?" Evelyn asked. Helena set down her cup. "His father," she said simply. "The eighth Duke was not a kind man. He was not a faithful man. He was, however, a very convincing one, and Adrian spent a great many years learning that the people who appeared reliable were often the ones who required the most caution." She paused. "Vivienne found that wound very quickly. She is good at finding wounds." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Outside, the November wind moved against the windows. "What did she tell him about me?" she asked. "That you had said to a mutual acquaintance that the engagement was beneath you, that you had called him," Helena's mouth thinned slightly, "adequate, as a match, given your options." Evelyn felt the word land somewhere precise and unpleasant. "I said no such thing." "I know you didn't," Helena said. "I also know my grandson well enough to understand that by the time it reached him, it had been arranged so carefully that it could not be disproved. No named source, no specific occasion, just the impression of a thing passed through enough mouths to give it the texture of fact." She looked at Evelyn steadily. "He believed it because he was ready to believe it, because it confirmed what he had already been told to fear." Evelyn thought about Adrian at their first dinner, with his polite, incurious gaze, arriving already certain of what he would find. "And the ball," she said. "The ball," Helena agreed, "was Vivienne ensuring the story wrote itself in public. 300 witnesses. Whatever happened afterward, the image existed, Adrian, raising his glass to another woman on the night of his own engagement. It could be used." "As leverage," Evelyn said. "Or as foundation, for a scandal, for dissolution, for whatever Richard needed it to be." They sat with this for a moment. Then Evelyn said, "He doesn't know any of this." "No." "And if we simply tell him?" "He will not believe it," Helena said, without hesitation. "Not without proof. Not about Vivienne. He has known her for 3 years, and she has been very careful about what she has built with him. And not," she paused, and her voice was not unkind, "about your brother. A man does not easily accept that he has been so completely deceived. His first instinct will be to doubt the person telling him." "Which would be me," Evelyn said. "Which would be you, who have, from his perspective, every reason to invent such a story." Evelyn was quiet for a moment, looking at her cold tea. "So we need proof," she said. "We need proof," Helena agreed, "and we need him to see it himself in a form he cannot reframe or explain away." She tilted her head slightly. "I assume you have been thinking about how." "I have one letter," Evelyn said. "I didn't take it, I couldn't take it without Richard knowing I had been in his study. But I know where it is, and I know what it says." "One letter from Vivienne to Richard is suggestive," Helena said. "It is not sufficient. We need her to confirm it herself in a form that can be witnessed." She paused. "Or we need Richard to confirm it." "Richard won't," Evelyn said immediately. "Not willingly, not to me." "No," Helena said, "but Vivienne might, under the right circumstances." She looked at Evelyn steadily. "She is intelligent, but intelligent people have a particular vulnerability. They believe they are the most intelligent person in any room they enter. It makes them predictable." Evelyn looked at her. "You have been thinking about this already," she said. The corner of Helena's mouth moved. "I have been thinking about it," she said, "since the morning after the ball. I simply needed to know whether you were the person to do it with." "And," Evelyn said. Helena picked up her teacup, found it cold, and set it down again with a small, decisive click. "You'll do," she said. "Now let us talk about what we are going to do." They talked for 2 hours. By the time Evelyn left Ravensmore House, the November afternoon had darkened to early evening, and the streets outside were lit by the pale glow of the gas lamps. She walked to the carriage with her hands folded and her face composed, the way she always walked, the way she had trained herself to walk through any room in any weather. Inside, she allowed herself one long, slow breath. The plan was not simple. It was not without risk. There were three things that needed to happen in a precise order, and any one of them could go wrong, and if they did, the consequences would be. Helena had not minimized this considerable. But it was a good plan. It was a careful plan. It had been built by two people who were, between them, very difficult to surprise. And it would require Evelyn to do something she had never done before. She would have to make Vivienne Sinclair afraid of her. Evelyn looked out the carriage window at the passing London streets, at the people moving through the lamplight, at the ordinary November evening proceeding around her as though nothing in particular were happening. She thought about the word obstacle. She thought about Adrian, carrying his long-held wound through a room full of people, being carefully aimed at a target he didn't know he was aimed at. She thought about Richard's desk and the letter beneath the Racing Gazette and the handwriting she now knew as well as her own. All right, she thought. Not the all right of a woman with no options. The all right of a woman who had just decided to use all of hers. The dinner was Helena's idea, which meant it was arranged perfectly. It was framed as an intimate gathering, 12 guests, Ravensmore House, the last week of November. The kind of evening that required no particular occasion, the kind Helena had hosted for 60 years with the ease of someone for whom social architecture was simply another language, spoken fluently and without effort. The invitations went out on a Monday. By Wednesday, all 12 had accepted. Richard accepted. Of course he did. An invitation from the Dowager Duchess of Ravensmore was not the kind of thing one declined without consequence, and Richard was too careful to give anyone cause to notice him avoiding anything. Vivienne accepted. This had required slightly more delicacy. Helena had framed it with precision, a small note, warmly worded, suggesting that as Adrian's particular friend, Lady Sinclair's presence would be a comfort to the family during what was, after all, a somewhat complicated period of transition. Vivienne would read that and hear, "You are acknowledged. You are included. You have nothing to fear." That was the point. Evelyn had argued, briefly, that Vivienne was too clever to be flattered into carelessness. Helena had said, "She is clever enough to know flattery when she sees it and vain enough to accept it anyway. That is the combination we require." Evelyn had thought about this and decided Helena was right. Helena was, she was discovering, right about a great many things. The evening was set for a Thursday. In the 10 days between the invitations and the dinner, Evelyn did three things. The first was to go back to Richard's study. She did not go to take the letter. It was gone by then, as she had expected, Richard being too careful to leave things lying about for long. But she went to look, carefully and thoroughly, at what else was there. She spent 40 minutes in that room while Richard was at his club, moving through his papers with the methodical patience that was her greatest gift, reading quickly and replacing everything exactly as she found it. She found 2 more letters. Not from Vivienne, these were from a man she didn't recognize, a name that meant nothing to her immediately, written in a cramped and businesslike hand. They discussed figures, dates, a property in Derbyshire that Evelyn recognized as part of her grandmother's estate, currently held in her trust. They discussed a transfer, conditional on certain events occurring before the 31st of December. Certain events. The dissolution of the engagement, the undermining of Evelyn's legal standing, the removal of the obstacle. Evelyn memorized the figures, the dates, the name. She replaced the letters. She left the room. The second thing she did was write to her grandmother's solicitor. Not her father's man, but the original solicitor, old Mr. Henshaw in Gray's Inn, who had drawn up the trust documents 30 years ago and was, as far as Evelyn knew, still living and still practicing. She wrote carefully, framing her questions as general inquiries about the terms of inherited trusts, the circumstances under which they could be challenged, the legal weight of social reputation in such challenges. She sent it by private messenger. Mr. Henshaw replied within 3 days. His answer was thorough and precise, and confirmed what Evelyn had suspected. The trust was solid. Richard could not touch it through legal means. What he could do, what he was apparently attempting to do, was create the social and reputational conditions under which Evelyn's own judgment might be called into question, her competence implied to be compromised, her ability to manage her own affairs made to seem doubtful. It was not a straightforward plan. It was the kind of plan that required patience and precision and a complete willingness to destroy someone quietly, from the inside out, without ever quite being visible while doing it. Evelyn sat with Mr. Henshaw's letter for a long time. She had grown up with Richard. She had sat across from him at dinner for 24 years. She had borrowed his books and accepted his occasional careless affections and thought him selfish but not wicked, ambitious but not cruel. She had been wrong about that. She filed the feeling away. There would be time for it later. The third thing Evelyn did was practice. She stood in front of the mirror in her room each morning for a week, and she rehearsed the conversation she intended to have with Vivienne Sinclair in every variation she could imagine. She practiced her expression and her tone and the precise words she would use and the ones she would withhold. She practiced the moment of revelation, the mention of the letter, not direct, not explicit, just enough, and she practiced what came after, the silence, the watching, the patience. She had been preparing for this conversation her entire life, she thought, without knowing it. Every room she had ever stood in quietly, every exchange she had ever watched without being watched, every piece of information she had ever filed away in that careful, organized mind. All of it had been, in some sense, practice for a single conversation with a woman who was very clever and very cornered and very dangerous. Evelyn intended to be more dangerous. The dinner was beautiful, as Helena's dinners always were. The table was dressed simply, white linen, good silver, candles in low arrangements that threw warm light across 12 faces without obscuring them. The food was excellent. The wine was chosen with the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and required no commentary on it. Evelyn sat 4 places from Adrian, close enough to observe, far enough to be unremarkable. She had worn her grandmother's pearls again. She had chosen a gown in deep blue that her mother had once said was too severe for her coloring, which Evelyn had always thought meant it made her look like someone who knew her own mind. She watched the table. Richard was in good form, charming, easy, working the room in the particular way he had, making each person feel they had his full attention. He had greeted Evelyn warmly at the door, kissed her cheek, told her she looked well. She had smiled and said he looked well also and meant neither thing at all. Vivienne arrived slightly late, which Evelyn suspected was deliberate, the entrance of someone who understood that arrival was a performance. She wore green again, a different shade from the ball, and moved through the room to Helena first, which was correct and careful, and then to Adrian, which was natural and warm and entirely observed. Evelyn noted the way Vivienne's eyes moved across the room, quick and systematic, cataloging. When they reached Evelyn, they paused for one fraction of a second longer than anywhere else. Evelyn smiled pleasantly and looked away. The opportunity came between the fish course and the meat. Vivienne excused herself from the table. Evelyn, who had been watching for precisely this, waited 90 seconds, excused herself also, and followed. She found her in the corridor outside the small room that the ladies used on such evenings, standing at the window at the end of the hall, looking out at the dark garden. Whether she was collecting herself or simply avoiding the room, Evelyn couldn't tell. She walked toward her with the unhurried calm of a woman who happened to be going in the same direction. "Lady Sinclair," she said pleasantly. Vivienne turned. Something moved across her face, very fast, very controlled, and then her smile appeared, warm and easy and entirely practiced. "Miss Ashford, are you enjoying the evening?" "Very much," Evelyn said. She stopped a comfortable distance away and clasped her hands lightly in front of her. "It is so kind of the Duchess to bring everyone together. She is remarkably thoughtful about such things." "She is." Vivienne agreed, with the slight carefulness of someone who was not entirely sure where they were being taken. Evelyn let the silence sit for a moment. Then she said, with the air of someone making pleasant small talk, "I have been meaning to ask you something, actually. I wonder if you might know a Mr." And she said the name from Richard's letters, the cramped businesslike hand, the figures and the dates. "I came across the name recently in connection with some family business, and I couldn't quite place him." The change in Vivienne was almost imperceptible. Almost. Her smile did not waver. Her posture did not shift. But something behind her eyes went very still, the particular stillness of a person whose mind has suddenly begun moving very fast. "I'm afraid I don't believe I know the name," she said. "How strange," Evelyn said mildly. "I was almost certain I had seen it in correspondence connected to you. Perhaps I am mistaken." She paused. "It was in connection with a property in Derbyshire, a trust matter, quite specific." The stillness behind Vivienne's eyes sharpened into something else. "I cannot imagine where you would have encountered such a connection," she said. Her voice was still smooth, still warm, but there was an edge beneath it now, fine as a blade. "No," Evelyn agreed. "It is quite a puzzle." She smiled pleasantly. "I am sure it will resolve itself." She excused herself and went into the side room and stood there alone for a moment, her hands clasped, breathing very steadily. It had worked. Vivienne was frightened. Not visibly. Vivienne would never be visibly frightened, not in Helena's corridor, not with 12 witnesses 30 feet away. But she was frightened, and more importantly, she would now need to act on that fear, and acting on fear was the fastest way to make mistakes. Evelyn smoothed her skirts. She went back to the table. What happened next was not part of the plan. Evelyn had been back in her seat for perhaps 8 minutes when she felt the atmosphere in the room change, not dramatically, just a small shift in the currents, the way a room changes when someone enters with intention. She looked up. Richard was watching her. Not the easy, social watching of a brother keeping half an eye on his sister across a dinner table. Something else. Focused and still and entirely without warmth. He had noticed her absence. He had noticed Vivienne's absence. He had, with the quick intelligence that she had consistently underestimated, added these two things together. Evelyn met his gaze. She did not look away. He knows, she thought. And then, across the table, Richard picked up his wine glass and turned smoothly to his neighbor and said something that made the man laugh. And the moment was gone, and Richard was himself again, easy, charming, entirely unconcerned. Worse than the stare. Evelyn's mind moved quickly. The plan had assumed Richard would remain unaware until it was too late. If he had guessed, even partially, he would move. He would move tonight or tomorrow, or he would speak to Vivienne, and Vivienne would close every door Evelyn had just begun to open. She needed to think. She needed, and then it went wrong. Not loudly, not dramatically. The way things go wrong when intelligent people are involved, quietly and fast, and from an unexpected direction. Vivienne returned to the table. She was composed, impeccably so, and she spoke with warmth to her neighbors and sipped her wine and gave no outward indication whatsoever that anything had occurred in the corridor. But she had, Evelyn realized, positioned herself slightly differently, angled just fractionally, toward the end of the table where Richard sat. They did not speak to each other. They did not need to. Evelyn watched the small, precise communication of two people who had practiced being invisible together, and understood that she had perhaps 15 minutes before Richard decided to manage the situation himself. She was trying to calculate what to do when the footman opened the dining room door, and Adrian appeared. He had stepped out briefly, Evelyn hadn't tracked when, and now he was returning, and he chose the moment, perfectly timed by no one, to enter the room from the far end, which meant he entered behind Evelyn, and what he saw, what he would have seen from that angle in that light, was Evelyn, turned in her chair, watching Richard and Vivienne with an expression that she had not had time to arrange. Not guilt, but intensity, focus, the look of someone in the middle of something. And Richard, who saw Adrian the same moment Evelyn did what Evelyn had not anticipated. He looked at his sister, and then he looked at Adrian. And then he said, into a small lull in the conversation, quite naturally, quite warmly, "There you are. We were just saying, weren't we, Evelyn, that the evening has been so much more interesting than expected?" Every head turned, including Adrian's. Evelyn felt the weight of his gaze across the room. She looked up. She met it. She could see, from his expression, exactly what he thought he was looking at. Her heart did not panic, but it dropped, slow and certain, like a stone through deep water. Not yet, she thought, not like this. The dinner ended at 10:30. Evelyn stood in the entrance hall with her wrap and her composed expression and watched the guests collect their things and say their goodbyes. And she did not look at Adrian, and she did not look at Richard, and she did not look at Vivienne, who left early, a headache. She said, with a smile of perfect sympathy directed at Helena, and swept out into the November night with the ease of someone who had accomplished what she came to do. Richard left shortly after. He kissed Evelyn's cheek at the door. "Lovely evening," he said, close to her ear. She felt the warning in it like a hand around her wrist. "Lovely," she agreed. She was pulling on her gloves in the entrance hall, the last of the guests, when Adrian appeared at the top of the stairs. "Miss Ashford." His voice was quiet, level, the voice of a man who had been managing his expression for the past 2 hours and was very tired of it. Evelyn looked up. He came down the stairs with that particular economy of movement she had observed from the beginning, nothing wasted, nothing careless, and stopped at the foot of them and looked at her and said, "I would like a word if you are willing." She was shown into the library. A fire was burning. Someone had left a lamp lit on the desk. The room smelled of wood smoke and leather and the particular mustiness of books that had been read many times and put back carefully. Adrian closed the door. He did not sit. He stood near the fireplace with his hands behind his back and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, not the polite distance of their early acquaintance, not the performed ease of the dinner table. Something rower, something that had run out of patience with itself. "What were you doing?" he said. "This evening." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "I beg your pardon." "You and Vivienne. You left the table at the same time. You were gone for 10 minutes, and when you came back you spent the remainder of the evening watching my family's dinner table like a woman reading a map." He paused. "I would like to know what is happening." Evelyn considered him for a moment. She had planned with Helena for many versions of this conversation. She had not planned for it to happen tonight in this room, with the timing destroyed and Richard already warned and everything slightly out of sequence. She had planned to be further along before Adrian was involved. She had planned to have more. But he was here, and he was asking, and she had learned a long time ago that some moments did not wait for better conditions. "I will tell you," she said, "but I need you to listen to all of it before you respond. Can you do that?" Something moved across his face. Not quite offense, something more complicated than that. "I am not in the habit of interrupting," he said. "No," she said, "but you may want to when you hear what I have to say," she told him. Not everything, not yet, not the solicitor's letter, not every piece she had assembled, but the shape of it. Richard's plan, Vivienne's role, the December meeting, the word obstacle, what had been built around him, carefully and patiently, using his own wound as the raw material. She spoke for perhaps 12 minutes. She kept her voice level. She did not embellish and she did not soften and she did not look away from his face, because she needed to see what happened there in real time in order to know how to continue. What happened was this. For the first 2 minutes, he listened with the controlled stillness of a man determined to hear something out fairly. For the next 4, something began to change behind his eyes, not belief, not yet, but the first uncomfortable stirring of a man who is beginning to feel the shape of something he doesn't want to feel. And then she said Vivienne's name in connection with Richard's, and she described the letter she had read in his study. And something in Adrian's face went very quiet in a way that was not the same as calm. "That," he said when she finished, "is a remarkable accusation." "Yes," Evelyn said, "it is." "Against your own brother." "Yes." "And against a woman I have known for 3 years." "Yes." He turned away from her. He stood facing the fire for a long moment, and Evelyn watched the line of his shoulders and waited. "You will understand," he said to the fireplace, "why I find this difficult to accept." "I understand completely," Evelyn said. "I would not accept it either without proof. I am not asking you to accept it. I am asking you to consider the possibility that it might be true. On the word of a woman who has every reason to discredit." "I know," Evelyn said quietly. "I know how this looks." He turned back. His expression was not angry. It was worse than angry. It was the face of a man in genuine pain, being asked to look at something he has been protected from seeing for a very long time. "She told me," he said, "that you had called me adequate as a match." The word landed again, precise and unpleasant, exactly as it had when Helena said it. "I know she did," Evelyn said. "Did you?" "No." "How am I to know that?" "You can't," Evelyn said. "Not from what I tell you. That is exactly the problem, and it is exactly why it was so effective." She paused. "You were told something that could not be disproved, and it confirmed something you were already afraid of, and so it became true for you before you ever met me. I walked into that dinner already convicted of something I had never done." The silence in the room was very complete. Adrian looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them moved. "The ball," he said, "it was not quite a question." "Was arranged," Evelyn said. "The moment, the audience, the toast, not by you. You were pointed at a target and trusted to fire, and you did because you had no reason not to." She paused. "I am not angry with you for it. I want you to understand that. I was briefly, but I am not now." He absorbed this in silence. "Why not?" he said finally. It was such a direct question, so unguarded, so unlike every other exchange they had ever had. Evelyn considered it honestly. "Because I have spent the past month understanding what was done to you," she said, "and it is very difficult to remain angry at a man for being deceived when you can see exactly how carefully the deception was constructed." Adrian looked at her for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, "I owe you an apology." "Not yet," Evelyn said. "After." "After what?" "After we finish this." She looked at him steadily. "I have most of what we need. I am missing one piece, and I need your help to get it." He did not say yes immediately. This was, Evelyn thought, actually encouraging. A man who said yes immediately to something this consequential was a man who wasn't thinking carefully enough. Adrian stood at the fireplace and was quiet for a long time, and she let him be quiet, because she had learned that silence was not the same as refusal, and that the right answer to waiting was more waiting. "The letters you saw in Richard's study," he said finally. "You can describe them, but you cannot produce them." "Correct." "And Vivienne, this evening, she gave you nothing explicit." "She gave me fear," Evelyn said. "Fear is a beginning, not an ending. She will move now that she knows I have seen something. When she moves, she will make contact with Richard or with the man named in his letters or both. And when she does, we need to be in a position to see it," Adrian said. "Your grandmother is already managing that part," Evelyn said. "There are things she can do that I cannot. There are people who will speak to her who will not speak to me." He looked up sharply. "Helena is involved in this." "Helena," Evelyn said, "was involved in this before I came to her. She had been watching and waiting for someone to bring her what she needed to act on what she already suspected." She paused. "She has been protecting you for a long time, Your Grace, rather more quietly than you perhaps realized." Something crossed his face at that, something she couldn't quite name, something that sat in the territory between pride and grief, and something more tender than either. He was quiet for another moment. Then, "What do you need from me?" "Access," Evelyn said. "There are letters between Vivienne and your solicitor's office, not your personal solicitor, a secondary firm your father used, which she has apparently maintained contact with. Your name gives you the right to request the correspondence. Mine does not. And if I find what you think I'll find, then we have proof that can be witnessed. That cannot be explained away." She looked at him steadily. "And then we end this." Adrian looked at the fire for a long moment. "All right," he said. Evelyn almost smiled. "I will tell your grandmother in the morning," she said. "She will know how to proceed." She moved toward the door. She had her hand on the handle when he spoke again. "Miss Ashford," she turned. He was still standing at the fireplace, and he looked, for the first time since she had met him, in all the dinners and balls and careful social performances, like himself. Whatever that was, whoever that was, the man underneath the title and the distance and the long-practiced reserve. He looked, she thought, rather like someone who had been holding his breath for a very long time and had just cautiously let some of it go. "Why," he said, "you could have walked away from this, from me. You would have been within your rights." Evelyn considered the question. She had asked it of herself more than once in the small hours of sleepless nights. "I could have," she said, "but then Richard would simply have found another way, and Vivienne would have moved on to another door." She paused. "And you would never have known that the woman they told you about did not exist." "Is that the reason?" he said, very quietly. Evelyn held his gaze for a moment. "It is one of them," she said. And she opened the door and walked out into the hall, and did not allow herself to think about the look on his face, until she was safely in the carriage and the dark streets of London were moving past the window, and there was no one to see her press her fingers briefly, lightly, to her own lips. Helena received the news the following morning with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this. She read the list of what Adrian had agreed to obtain. She set it down. She looked at Evelyn across the breakfast table. "Good," she said. "He is faster than I expected." "He is not slow," Evelyn agreed. "No," Helena said. "He never was. He simply needed someone to be honest with him." She picked up her tea. "It has been some time since anyone managed it." Evelyn looked at her. "How long?" Helena considered. "Since his mother died," she said simply. 17 years. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the November morning was pale and cold and entirely clear. One of those rare winter days when the light is sharp enough to see everything precisely. "We have perhaps a week," Evelyn said, "before Richard acts." "Less," Helena said. "4 days, perhaps 5. "Then we should move quickly." "Yes," Helena said. She set down her cup with that small, decisive click that Evelyn had come to recognize as the sound of a decision being made. "We should." The letters arrived on the 3rd day. Adrian brought them to Helena's sitting room in the late afternoon, and the 3 of them sat together around the fire, the old Duchess, the young Duke, and the woman who was technically his fiancée and had become, in the strangest and most unplanned way, something else entirely, and read them in silence. They were worse than Evelyn had expected. Not in tone, they were careful, businesslike, the kind of letters that had been written to be defensible if found, but in detail, in the precision of the plan, in the coldness of it, the way Evelyn's name appeared in them not as a person but as a variable, a factor, a thing to be managed. She read her own name and felt something pass through her that was not quite anger and not quite grief, that same unnamed feeling from before, larger now, heavier. She set the letters down. She looked at Adrian. He had gone very still, very pale, the kind of stillness that is not calm at all but its opposite, a man holding himself together by an act of will, because the alternative was something he was not prepared to do in front of anyone. "Adrian," Helena said. He looked at his grandmother. She held out her hand across the small space between their chairs. He looked at it for a moment. Then he took it and held it and said nothing, and the fire burned quietly between them all. Evelyn looked away. She looked at the window, at the pale winter afternoon, at the bare trees moving slightly in the wind outside. She gave them the moment. It was not hers. But when Adrian finally released his grandmother's hand and looked across at Evelyn, his eyes were clear, not empty, not controlled, but clear in the way that comes after something has finally been seen and cannot be unseen. She met his gaze and held it. "Now," she said quietly, "now we end it." It was Helena who chose the day. The 1st of December, a Monday, 11 days before the scheduled meeting with the solicitors that Richard had built his entire plan around. She sent the invitations on Friday, not formal cards, not the careful social architecture of the dinner, but brief personal notes, handwritten, delivered by her own footman. One to Richard, one to Vivienne. One to the man named in the letters, whose full name Evelyn now knew. A Mr. Gerald Fitch, formerly of the secondary solicitor's firm Adrian's father had used, currently operating a private financial practice in the city that was, as Adrian's own solicitor had confirmed upon investigation, not entirely above reproach. The note said only that the Dowager Duchess of Ravensmore requested their presence at Ravensmore House on Monday at 3 o'clock, in connection with a matter of some urgency regarding the estate. Nothing more. Helena had explained her reasoning to Evelyn and Adrian on the Thursday evening, sitting by her fire with her hands folded in her lap, and her expression of absolute composure. "They will come," she said, "because they cannot afford not to. Richard cannot refuse an invitation from me without raising questions he does not want raised. Vivienne cannot refuse because she is afraid of what I might do if she does not appear. And Fitch cannot refuse because Adrian's name is on the note, and Fitch knows very well what is in those letters, and a man who knows what is in those letters does not ignore a summons from the Duke of Ravensmore." "And when they arrive?" Evelyn asked. "When they arrive," Helena said, "we will be ready." Evelyn did not sleep on Sunday night. She lay in the dark and went through it methodically, the way she always managed the things that frightened her, not by pretending they didn't, but by examining them so thoroughly that they became familiar, and familiar things were easier to face than unknown ones. She was afraid that Richard would find a way out of it. She was afraid that Vivienne would be too controlled, too careful, that she would look at the letters and smile, and say there was some other explanation, some misunderstanding, and that the room would fill with doubt instead of clarity. She was afraid, in a quieter and more private part of herself, of what came after, of the space on the other side of this, when the machinery had stopped and the dust had settled, and she and Adrian Blackwell were left standing in the remains of a plan that had been built by other people, looking at each other across the wreckage, trying to determine what, if anything, was actually theirs. She had told him that his question, why, had more than one answer. She had not told him what the other answers were. She was not entirely sure she was ready to. She got up before dawn and sat by her window and watched the December dark give way, slowly and without drama, to a pale and colorless morning. All right, she thought, and went to get dressed. They arrived separately, as Helena had anticipated. Fitch came first, a compact, careful man in his 50s with a solicitor's instinct for reading a room, who took one look at Helena seated at the head of the long table in the formal drawing room and went slightly gray around the edges. He sat where he was indicated and said nothing and watched the door. Richard arrived at 3:05, and Evelyn, standing near the window, watched his face as he came through the door and saw Fitch, and saw her, and then saw Adrian standing beside the fireplace with his hands behind his back, and his expression absolutely composed. Richard's face did not change. This was, she thought, almost impressive. He had always been good at that. "Aunt Helena," he said pleasantly. He had always called her that, though she was no relation. What a charming surprise. Richard, Helena said, sit down. Vivienne arrived at 10 past. She came through the door with her usual composure and her usual beauty, wearing deep red, her dark eyes moving across the room with that quick, systematic intelligence. They stopped at Evelyn. They moved to Adrian. They moved to Fitch, and there, just for a fraction of a second, something flickered. She sat. She arranged her skirts. She smiled at Helena. Your Grace, she said warmly, how lovely. Is it? Helena said. It was not a question. Helena ran the room the way she ran everything, without visible effort, without drama, with the absolute authority of a woman who had not needed to raise her voice in 40 years, because she had never once needed to. She began with Fitch. She placed the letters on the table, Adrian's letters, the ones from the secondary firm, and she looked at Fitch and she said, in a tone of perfect pleasantness, I wonder if you might help me understand these. Fitch looked at the letters. His face went from gray to something closer to white. Your Grace, They concern a trust, Helena continued, as though he hadn't spoken. A trust belonging to Miss Evelyn Ashford, who is, as you are aware, engaged to my grandson. They describe a plan to challenge that trust on grounds of, let me find the precise wording, she turned a page, compromised social standing and demonstrated incapacity for independent judgment. She looked up. I find the wording interesting, particularly the word demonstrated. As though the compromising and the demonstrating were things that could be arranged in advance. The room was very quiet. I don't, Fitch began. The letters are in your handwriting, Adrian said from the fireplace, quietly, without heat. I had them verified on Saturday by 3 independent parties. Fitch closed his mouth. Richard, Evelyn noted, had not moved. He was sitting very still, with his hands on the table and his pleasant expression intact, watching the room with the focused attention of a man calculating his remaining options. She watched him do it. She watched him work through it, quickly and efficiently, the way his mind always worked. And then she watched him reach his conclusion. He turned to Evelyn. This is extraordinary, he said, with a warmth that was almost admirable. Evelyn, I don't know what you've been told or what these letters are supposed to. Richard, Evelyn said. He stopped. Don't, she said quietly. Something happened in his face. Very small, very fast. The slipping of a mask that had been worn for so long that the face beneath it was almost unfamiliar. These are my family, he said. And for one moment, one single, unguarded moment, she heard something in his voice that might have been real. I know what you needed, Evelyn said. I know exactly what you needed and why and how much. I am not without sympathy for the position you were in. She held his gaze. But you chose to make me an obstacle. You chose to use a man who had done nothing to deserve it. And you chose to let Vivienne do things to both of us that cannot be. Evelyn, his voice had changed, flatter now, harder. No, she said simply, and that was all. Vivienne lasted longer than Fitch and longer than Richard. She sat through Helena's presentation of the letters, through Fitch's crumbling, through Richard's brief attempt at deflection, with a composure that Evelyn genuinely admired in the abstract. The composure of a woman who had survived difficult rooms before and knew that composure itself was a form of power. But Helena had been waiting for Vivienne specifically. When the room had gone quiet, when Richard had stopped speaking and Fitch was staring at the table and Adrian had not moved from the fireplace, Helena turned to Vivienne and looked at her for a long and unhurried moment. Lady Sinclair, she said, I want to ask you something directly and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Vivienne met her gaze. Of course. My grandson, Helena said, has been your friend for 3 years. I use the word friend because that is the word he has used, and I have chosen until now to respect his characterization. She paused. What did you tell him about Miss Ashford? Vivienne's eyes moved to Adrian, then back to Helena. I don't know what you mean, she said. I think you do, Helena said. I think you knew exactly what wound to find and exactly what to put in it. I think you are very good at that, and I think you have been doing it for a long time, and I think that is the thing that I want you to answer for, more than the letters, more than Fitch, more than Richard's money." Her voice was entirely even, because the rest of it can be addressed by solicitors. But what you did to my grandson is not something solicitors address. The room was very, very still. Vivienne looked at Helena for a long moment. And then, with the precision of a woman choosing the least damaging of available options, she said, "I may have interpreted things to him, at times, in ways that were not entirely complete." "Interpreted," Helena repeated. "I believed it was for his benefit," Vivienne said. "He was entering an arrangement he had not chosen. I was trying to protect." "Vivienne," Adrian's voice from the fireplace, quiet and absolutely final, she stopped. He looked at her. He had not spoken since the beginning, since the letters. He had stood at the fireplace and let Helena run the room, which was right, and he had listened to everything, which Evelyn suspected had cost him considerably. "I trusted you," he said. "I trusted very few people, and you were one of them, and I would like you to know that I understand exactly what that means and what it cost, and I do not intend to say anything else about it." Vivienne looked at him. Something moved across her face, not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that might have been guilt if it had been given different conditions to grow in. "Adrian," "I think," Helena said pleasantly, "that we are finished." Fitch agreed to full disclosure to the relevant authorities by the end of the week, in exchange for Helena's agreement not to pursue the matter through the courts, which would have been public and loud and considerably worse for him. Helena made this agreement with the expression of someone granting a minor concession, which was, Evelyn suspected, exactly how she felt about it. Richard left without speaking to Evelyn again. She watched him go out the door down the steps into the December street and felt the thing that had been sitting in her chest since she read his letter finally, slowly, begin to dissolve. Not into nothing, not cleanly, but into something smaller and more manageable, something she could carry without it carrying her. He was her brother. That would not stop being true. But he had made his choices, and so had she. And the space between those two things was simply where they would have to live from now on. Vivienne left shortly after, with the particular grace of a woman who was already planning her next move before she reached the door. She would recover, Evelyn thought. She was too capable not to. She would find another room, another door, another man who could be told the right things at the right moment. Evelyn hoped, without any particular conviction, that she would choose differently next time. The room emptied until there were only 3 of them left, Helena, Adrian, and Evelyn. Helena looked at them both for a moment. Then she stood, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who has earned the right to move at whatever pace she pleases. "I find," she said, "that I am in need of tea and a considerable amount of quiet." She picked up her letters from the table. "I trust you can manage without me for a few minutes." She walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. "Evelyn," she said without turning. "Your Grace." "Well done," Helena said. And she went out and closed the door behind her, and the room settled into silence, and Evelyn and Adrian were alone. The fire had burned low. Evelyn stood near the window. Adrian stood near the fireplace. The December afternoon was fading outside, the light going from pale to gray, and the room was warm and quiet and full of everything that had not yet been said. Adrian spoke first. "I owe you," he said, "a great deal more than an apology." "You owe me an apology," Evelyn said. "Start there." He crossed the room. Not quickly, with that same economy of movement, measured and deliberate, as though he was very conscious of each step. He stopped in front of her, and he was close enough now that she could see his face clearly in the fading light, without the careful management of expression that she had grown accustomed to reading around. Without it, he looked different. Not younger exactly, just less defended. "I am sorry," he said, "for the ball, for what I believed about you, for the distance I kept and the assumption I made, and the fact that I walked into an engagement with a woman I had already decided I knew, based on something I was told by someone whose interests were not mine. He paused. And I am sorry that it took me this long to see you clearly. Evelyn looked at him. That is a very good apology, she said. I have been composing it, he said, for approximately 4 days. She felt the corner of her mouth move. It shows. He looked at her, really looked at her, the way she had been looking at him for weeks, with the kind of attention that sees rather than simply observes. And she let him because she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not mind. I would like, he said carefully, to begin again, if that is something you are willing to consider. Begin again, Evelyn repeated. As people who have chosen each other, rather than people who were chosen for each other. He paused. I recognize that I have not given you a great deal of reason to be willing. I recognize that you owe me nothing, and that walking away would be entirely reasonable, and that if you chose to do so, I would have no grounds whatsoever to object. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She thought about the March morning when her mother had appeared in the library doorway, and she had said all right into the middle distance, watching the sparrow fight the wind. She thought about the ball and the toast and the 300 witnesses, and the moment she had decided, in the space between hearing his voice and raising her glass, that she was not going to do nothing. She thought about a man carrying something heavy for a very long time, and a grandmother who had been quietly protecting him for 17 years, and the look on his face when he had read the letters in which she was described as a variable, a factor, a thing to be managed, and had understood, finally and completely, what had been done to them both. She thought about him asking why, in the library by the fire, with that raw and unguarded directness. She thought about the answers she hadn't given. Ask me something, she said. He looked at her. I beg your pardon. Ask me something real, she said. Not about the letters, not about Richard, not about any of this. Ask me something you actually want to know. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him considering it, not performing consideration, actually doing it, which was, she had come to understand, what he looked like when he was being genuine. What were you thinking, he said, at the ball, when I raised my glass, in that moment before you raised yours? Evelyn looked at him. I was thinking, she said, that something was wrong, not with you, with the situation, with the way it had been arranged. She paused. I was thinking that a man does not look the way you looked in that moment unless he is carrying something he did not choose to carry, and I was thinking that I wanted to understand what it was. You were not angry, he said, not a question, almost wondering. I was briefly later, she said, but in that moment, no, I was curious. She paused. I am almost always curious first. He looked at her for a long moment. That, he said quietly, is the most extraordinary thing anyone has ever said to me. Evelyn considered him. She thought about the sparrow, stubborn against the wind. All right, she said. His expression shifted a question. I will consider it, she said. Beginning again, I make no promises beyond consideration. You will have to earn the rest. I understand, he said. I am not easy to know, she said. I am told I am too quiet and too observant, and that I think too much, and I will tell you plainly that I have no intention of changing any of those things. I would not ask you to, he said. And I will not be managed, she said, or arranged or pointed at targets by anyone. No, he said, and something in his voice, in the single syllable of it, was so entirely certain, so completely without qualification, that Evelyn felt something in her chest shift, small and quiet and entirely unexpected. Good, she said. She held out her hand. He looked at it for a moment, this careful, deliberate, finally undefended man, and then he took it and held it, and did not let go. Outside the window, the December evening had settled into a deep and quiet dark. Somewhere in the house, a clock was ticking. The fire was very low. Neither of them moved to leave. 1 year later, almost to the day, Ravensmore House was lit from every window. The ballroom had been dressed in winter white and deep green, and the orchestra was playing something that was not quite a waltz and not quite anything else. Something warmer, Evelyn thought. Something that had been chosen by someone who understood that music could say what rooms could not. The candles were lit. The champagne was very good. 300 guests moved through the light and the warmth with the particular ease of people who had come not to be seen, but to celebrate something they actually believed in. This was, she had learned, a rare thing. She was standing near the far window, her window, the one she always found in any room, the one that gave her the angle she preferred, when Helena appeared beside her. The Dowager Duchess moved quietly for a woman of 82. Evelyn had stopped being surprised by it. "You are watching again," Helena said. "I am always watching," Evelyn said. "Yes," Helena said, "it is one of your better qualities." She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing footman and looked out at the room with the expression she always wore in crowds, fond, unsentimental, entirely clear-eyed. "How are you?" "I am well," Evelyn said. "That is not what I asked." Evelyn looked at her. Helena looked back, with those black eyes that missed nothing and forgave a great deal. "I am happy," Evelyn said. "I am still somewhat surprised by that, but I am." Helena made the small sound that was her version of a laugh. "Good," she said. "You have earned it, both of you have." She paused. "He is looking for you incidentally." "He is always looking for me," Evelyn said. "Yes," Helena said simply, "he is." She moved away into the crowd, unhurried, stopping here and there with the ease of someone who had been the most important person in every room she had ever entered, and had long since stopped needing anyone to notice. Evelyn watched her go. Then she looked across the ballroom. She found him before he found her, which was usually how it went. He was near the center of the room, speaking with a group of men she recognized, a cabinet minister, 2 lords, someone from the Foreign Office whose name she could never remember. Wearing his title with the ease that had taken him, she had come to understand, a great deal of effort to develop. He was good at this. He was good at rooms, good at people, good at the performance of a duke. But she could see, from across the ballroom, the particular quality of attention he was paying to the conversation present, but not entirely. Part of him was somewhere else, looking, she knew, for her. She watched him for a moment. She thought about the March morning when she had said all right to her mother, watching the sparrow in the garden. She thought about the October night of the ball, and the December afternoon in the drawing room, and the evening in the library when he had asked why and she had given him half an answer. She had given him the rest of it, eventually. Not all at once. She was not built for all at once. In pieces, over the months that followed, in the conversations that happened when rooms had emptied and fires had burned low, and there was nothing left to perform for anyone. She had given him the rest of the answers, and he had received them with the careful, deliberate attention that was his particular gift. And she had discovered, slowly, thoroughly, in the way she discovered all important things, that being known was not the same as being managed. That the right person knowing you felt entirely different from the wrong ones trying to. He looked up. Across the room, through the crowd and the candlelight and the 300 guests, he found her immediately. He always did. She had stopped finding this surprising and had started finding it something she did not have a precise word for, something warmer than comfort and quieter than joy, something that had settled into the ordinary fabric of her days without announcement. He said something brief to the cabinet minister. He moved through the room toward her. "There you are," he said when he reached her. "I have been here," she said. "You were not looking in the right direction." "I was always looking in the right direction," he said. "I was simply obstructed." She looked at him. He looked back, with that expression she had watched develop over 12 months, the one that had no management in it, no careful distance, no performance for a room. The one that was simply him looking at her in the way she had once thought he was constitutionally incapable of. She had been wrong about that. She had been wrong about a number of things in the early days. She had thought him cold. She had thought him careless. She had thought the distance was indifference when it was something else entirely, something that had needed simply the right conditions to become what it actually was. She had provided the conditions. He had done the rest. "They are waiting," she said. "I know," he said. "Are you ready?" Evelyn looked out at the room, at the 300 guests, at the candles and the champagne, and the orchestra playing its warm, unclassifiable music, at Helena near the far wall speaking to a bishop, with the expression of a woman winning an argument she has not technically started yet, at the window where Evelyn had stood a year ago in white and pearls, watching a man raise his glass and say another woman's name. "Yes," she said. He offered her his arm, she took it. They moved together toward the center of the room, and the crowd parted in that way crowds do when they sense that something worth watching is about to happen, and the orchestra played on, and the candles burned, and somewhere near the back of the room a woman in a blue gown, a deep, decided blue, the blue of someone who knows her own mind, stood beside a tall, dark-haired man who had learned, over the course of a very difficult year, what it meant to actually see someone. The room settled. The orchestra paused. Adrian Blackwell, the 9th Duke of Ravensmore, raised his glass. 300 guests held their breath. Evelyn watched his face. She saw no grief in it, no weight, no carefully managed distance. She saw only the expression she had been watching develop for 12 months, clear and certain and entirely, quietly his. "To my wife," he said, his voice carried across the room without effort, without performance. "The woman who saw the truth of things when I could not, who chose when she had every reason not to stay, who taught me that silence is not emptiness and that patience is not weakness, and that the most remarkable thing in any room is not always the loudest." He paused. "Who saved me," he said, "when I did not deserve it, and who has made me every day since try to deserve it." The room was very still. Evelyn looked at him. She thought about a sparrow stubborn against the wind. She thought about all right and what it meant, and how many different things it had meant in the past 2 years and what it meant now. She raised her own glass. "To the Duke of Ravensmore," she said, clearly enough for the nearest guests to hear, "who asked the right questions eventually." A ripple of laughter moved through the room, warm, real, the kind that belonged. Adrian looked at her, and his eyes held that thing she had no precise word for, that warm, quiet, settled thing, and he said, low enough for only her, "Only eventually." "You had assistance," she said. "I had you," he said. "Yes," Evelyn said, "you did." She touched her glass to his. The orchestra began again. And in the back of the room, the Dowager Duchess of Ravensmore set down her champagne, looked at the two of them standing in the candlelight, and made the small sound that was her version of a laugh. Then she turned back to the bishop and resumed winning her argument, and the ball went on. The ball always goes on. But some nights, some rare and particular nights, the people inside it are exactly where they are supposed to be. This was one of those nights. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.